Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
The earliest that a fetus can survive on the outside, that we can help the baby on the outside, is about 22, at the very earliest, 22 weeks. Before that, the chances of getting to that point where you will have a baby that can survive on the outside is low. And the risk to mom is high. She can get infected, she can go into labor and start bleeding and start hemorrhaging. And so we wanted to make sure that we were not going to sit on these really scary cases and wait for a lawyer to tell us if it's a medical emergency or not. We really wanted to emphasize that we were the experts who could determine whether a patient needed a procedure or not.
I'm Rod Milan. In the wake of last week's U.S. Supreme Court overruling Roe v. Wade and Missouri's trigger law that effectively bans most abortions in the state, people have concerns about how the new state law is going to affect gynecological and obstetrics care here in the state of Missouri. Now, the law prohibits abortion except in cases of medical emergency, which it defines as serious risk of substantial and irreversible physical impairment of a major bodily function. How exactly that definition is interpreted, though, is up for consideration. For gynecologists and obstetrics care providers in Missouri, this is a critical definition, however, because the law states that any person who knowingly performs or induces an abortion shall be guilty of a Class B felony, and they could also face suspension or revocation of their medical license. Joining us now to discuss how providers see this new law is Dr. Jeannie Kelly. She's an Associate Division Director of Maternal Fetal Medicine, Medical Director of Obstetric Inpatient Service and Maternal Transport, and Medical Director of the Care Clinic at Washington University. Dr. Kelly, thank you for coming on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I'm very curious right off the bat, what was your reaction to the news on Friday? It was teased out a little bit earlier when we had the draft opinion that came out by the Supreme Court. And so what was your reaction to the news? And also specifically, what have you been considering as to how this new law relates to your practice and work with the patients that you see?
Yeah, I'm a high-risk obstetrician, so I specifically take care of women and patients who have pregnancies that are complicated. That can be complicated because there is a maternal disease, or mom is really, really sick from a certain, situation going on, or the baby's really sick. Mm-hmm. And I think my first reaction to the news coming out on Friday is worry and concern because, abortion is performed in Missouri very rarely already prior to overturning of Roe versus Wade. It really is only performed in situations of emergencies or very complex medical cases or very sick fetal diagnoses. And so knowing what the trigger law states in these narrow scope of kind of what is now allowed, we were really worried for our patients.
And do you have solid guidance on what constitutes a medical emergency now that that is kind of the law of the land of a pregnant patient underneath the new Missouri law, I guess, that has taken place because of the decision?
I think that's the crux of my worry and our concern in the obstetrics and gynecology world. There are certain cases where we think a medical emergency is pretty easy. If a patient is hemorrhaging in front of you and is going to die unless the pregnancy is removed, that seems pretty clear to qualify as a medical emergency. If a patient has an infection in the uterus that is causing her to be extremely critically ill, removing the pregnancy is the only way to save her life in that instance. But I think medicine in general is not really black and white in many circumstances. And I think there are many clinical situations that we are concerned, the law is vague and the law is not well defined of these trickier situations where we're not sure, is this a medical emergency? Does it qualify as an exception to this abortion ban? Or would we be risking our licenses and our, would be risking jail time if we performed the abortion in this circumstance?
So it's early days since this change in the law has actually taken effect. Have you had any cases yet where you've had maybe a borderline decision?
It's only been a few days. I am thankful to say that I have not been personally faced with a situation so far.
But are you concerned about the chance of a pregnant patient's medical emergency being called into question? Because, is it really emergency? You said, yes, there are two circumstances that you came up with, one of which was, bleeding in front of an actual doctor. But what's it like? And again, it's early days to have those kind of questions now have to creep into your mind.
Oh, it's stressful. I think we have watched our colleagues in Texas already go through this with the heartbeat bill that passed there a few months ago. And there are some very concerning stories that have come out from our colleagues in Texas, hospitals, doctors, healthcare systems that have sat on really scary cases like an ectopic pregnancy where the embryo is implanted outside of the uterus.
Okay.
There's 0% chance that pregnancy can be normal. There's 0% chance that a baby can be born from that pregnancy that will survive. And the risk for mom for a death and or irreversible bodily harm is extremely high in that circumstance, unless the pregnancy is removed. We've heard stories where hospitals, doctors are scared and have sat on these cases instead of providing standard of care. These are really concerning stories, concerning situations that are coming out of these states, and we definitely are worried that will happen here in Missouri.
Do you have another example as well on top of the ectopic pregnancy that you can think of?
Sure. One of the situations that is really tricky and really gray at this point is sometimes, let's say you break your water at 18, 19 weeks. The earliest that a fetus can survive on the outside, that we can help the baby on the outside, is about 22, at the very earliest, 22 weeks. And even if the baby is born at 22 weeks, it's a scary course for that baby. Not all of them will survive. Most of them will not. But if you break your water even earlier than that, 4 or 5 weeks before that, the chances of getting to that point where you will have a baby that can survive on the outside is low. And the risk to mom is high. She can get infected. She can go into labor and start bleeding and start hemorrhaging. This is that gray area that we're not really sure how to interpret the law. And I think there's a lot of concern in the obstetrics community. What can you offer this patient if she says, I don't want to take on the risks of continuing on the pregnancy? We're not entirely clear what that falls under.
Now, in that particular case, has that been encountered in Texas already? That already had the fetal heartbeat law in place?
Absolutely. So I think that situation, even before Roe versus Wade was overturned, has been interpreted differently by many different hospital systems. And there would be different things offered to different patients, depending on which hospital you were in, if you found yourself in that situation.
Okay. And we had a question actually that came in from Pat on Facebook, and it kind of skirts around the same issue that we're talking about. How does the state define what, quote, severely threatened, close quote, means? Does her doctor have to determine her chances of surviving the birth? Is it an 80% chance? Is it a 90% chance? Can the doctor be sued if they are wrong and the mother dies in childbirth? Those are three different questions. And again, you said they haven't been decided yet, but do you have any sense of what Pat was talking about on Facebook?
These are the very questions that we're all grappling with in the obstetrics community. How close to death is a medical emergency do you have to be? That's not defined by the law, and it's extremely vague, which is up for interpretation. As for me, as an expert in this field, I feel that it is my expertise and my ability to tell when a patient is in a medical emergency, where I can determine that if we don't remove the pregnancy, that she is at risk for dying or having, irreversible bodily harm as per the law. But I can imagine that there are, other doctors who are really scared and who are fearful of making the wrong choice. And the other side of this is if you don't make that choice, women will die.
Mm-hmm. So also from Instagram, a user named Aurelia asks, how will this ruling impact the treatment of miscarriages? And will medications and dilation and curettage procedures, also known as DNCs, will those still be available?
Yes. So per the law right now, miscarriage management in the state of Missouri has not changed and should not change from the standard of care. That being said, I can understand that there may be reluctance among physicians, nurses, hospitals of treating certain miscarriages because they do involve some of the same procedures and medications that we would otherwise use for abortion.
Mm-hmm. So you're at WashU. Do you practice at WashU clinics or do you practice at BJC health centers?
I do both. So we're employed by WashU. And I practice at a variety of BJC hospitals.
Is this the discussion that you've had with some of the doctors who would normally, before last Friday, have been involved in procedures that might be considered abortions?
Absolutely. This has been an ongoing conversation ever since the leak came out a few months ago, kind of prepping for this day. Knowing what our colleagues in Texas have gone through, we wanted to make sure that we all understood it is still our job and within the law to provide care that saves a woman's life and or prevents bodily harm. And so we wanted to make sure that we were not going to sit on these really scary cases and wait for a lawyer to tell us if it's a medical emergency or not. We really wanted to emphasize that we were the experts who could determine whether a patient needed a procedure or not per the standard of care.
Mm-hmm. With those, and we talked specifically about some of the procedures that have gone through, and with now the standard being really basically in case the mother actually dies, what levels of consideration are given to the child if the child were born, like if the child were stillborn? Is that in the gray area? Is that something that you've found as well? And have you learned anything from the Texas doctors who were dealing with something more along the lines of the Supreme Court decision that came out last Friday?
Yeah, I would say that a stillbirth is along the spectrum of a miscarriage. And management of a stillbirth would not change based on the trigger ban that's in place right now. Again, that being said, many of the same procedures and medications that we use to manage those stillbirths are also used in abortion. And I certainly worry that there will be reluctance to use them appropriately.
So what qualifies as a stillbirth? I mean, again, these are questions that are really up in the air. If a child were born severely brain damaged, if they were carried all the way to term, and I guess that wouldn't be stillbirth, but that would be birth with severe damage to the actual child once the child was actually born. Would it be if they were born without lungs, or if lungs were on the outside of the body, or if the brain were severely damaged? Again, these are questions that are kind of up in the air. Have you addressed those yet, or have you learned anything from Texas?
These are really great questions. So a stillbirth is defined by a pregnancy that passes away on the inside. Prior to 20 weeks, it's called a miscarriage. Mm-hmm. After 20 weeks, if the heart stops beating, it's called a stillbirth or an intrauterine fetal demise. The second part of your question refers to fetuses and babies who have very serious illness. Mm-hmm. That could be anomalies that are not compatible with life on the outside of the uterus and or will result in a short and, complicated life for that baby once it's born. Prior to Roe versus Wade being overturned, there are a number of clinics in Illinois and close by who would offer these patients a surgical abortion if they decided that bringing a pregnancy like this to term was not right for their baby or that was not a life that they wanted for their baby. We, as high-risk obstetricians, we could offer for some families who wanted to deliver the baby, to hold the baby. These are, after all, highly desired, highly wanted, highly loved pregnancies. For the families who wanted to deliver the babies and hold them as part of their grieving process, we offered them what's called an induction abortion, where we induce labor. They go through labor, they birth the child, and they're able to hold, the baby after it's born. However, after Roe versus Wade has been overturned, that's no longer something that we can offer our patients.
And one final question, what conversations are you finding yourself having with other healthcare providers, again, in these early days, including nurses and other OB-GYNs in the wake of Roe being overturned?
I think it is, we have to understand that this is not just an obstetrics and gynecology problem. We share a lot of patients with many other specialists and subspecialists. We have pregnant moms who've had liver transplants. We've had pregnant moms who have brain cancer. We have pregnant moms who have really complicated cardiac disease. These are patients of other providers, cardiologists, gastroenterologists, neurosurgeons, et cetera, who all have to take care of these patients now when they're pregnant as well. We are really trying to spread the word among the whole medical community that this Roe versus Wade impacts not just us but their care as well. We emphasize, talking about family planning with these patients, talking about contraception if pregnancy is not in their future, and if pregnancy is being contemplated, to please come see us to talk about that, and plan for it in the healthiest way possible.
And how are you asking those questions of your colleagues that are in different areas of specialty?
There are conversations that are ongoing. I think everyone in the medical community is aware that this is a pretty big change that has happened across the country, and we are having those conversations with each of those specialties.
Okay. Dr. Jeannie Kelly, she's an Associate Division Director of Maternal Fetal Medicine, also Medical Director of Obstetric Inpatient Service and Maternal Transport, and Medical Director of the Care Clinic at Washington University. Thank you very much for joining us today on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today's episode was produced by Emily Woodbury with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.